Imagine dusk settling over a New England village. The sky bruised, the river slowing to a cold, dark ribbon, and lamps being lit in clapboard windows. In one simple parlor, a girl clutches her bedclothes and screams, pointing at nothing that others can see. Somewhere else, a husband finds his wife unable to rise, her limbs contorted by a force no physician can name. Then, as neighbors gather and the town's elders assemble beneath candlelight, an entire legal and religious system leans in to hear what the afflicted will say. What begins as a private terror becomes a public trial, and what follows is a spiral of accusations that will hang citizens, break families, and echo across centuries as an unchecked warning about fear. This was the world of Salem in 1692, a world of sermons and superstition, of Puritan anxieties and frontier threat, where a few frightened voices ignited one of the most infamous episodes of mass hysteria in American history. When winter turned to spring in 1692, Salem Village, a community knitted together by church membership, land disputes, and a fierce appetite for moral order, lay on the edge of the Massachusetts frontier. New England's Puritans read the world as a battleground between God and the devil. Inexplicable misfortune, sudden illness, or a failure of harvest could be read as the work of malevolent spirits or collusion with Satan. Into that cultural tinderbox stepped a handful of young women and girls, Betty Paris and her cousin Abigail Williams, daughters and relatives of local ministers and servants. Their strange fits, contortions, trances, and accusations were not private afflictions. They resonated with every anxious conversation held in meeting houses and kitchens. The earliest episodes of complaint focused on a handful of figures at the margins of village life. Tituba, an enslaved woman of Barbadian origin in the household of Reverend Samuel Paris, whose background and differences were already a source of suspicion. Sarah Good, a mendicant woman of erratic temper and unstable home. And Sarah Osborne, older and litigious, who had previously been in disputes with local families. When the afflicted girls began to say that they were being pinched and tormented by the specters of these women, the village heard a familiar script and responded with grim alacrity. Court records and depositions from the period, preserved in the compiled volumes known to historians as the Salem Witchcraft Papers, reveal the language of those early days. Witnesses swore to the suddenness of fits, to nighttime contortions, and to spectral visitations, motions of invisible hands, visions of shapes sitting upon the chests of the afflicted, and fingers that marked flesh though no physical hand was present. These depositions were not casual notes, they were legal testimony, sworn before magistrates. In the era's logic, the vision of a suffering victim, who could identify her tormentor by sight, by name, by manner, carried weight. The devil, it seemed, could send his emissary in spectral guise, and the courts were invited to record what the afflicted described. That invitation opened the courthouse to a form of evidence almost unthinkable to modern jurists: spectral evidence. Testimony that the accused had appeared to the afflicted in spirit, even when the accused were physically elsewhere. To the judges and ministers of Salem, the fact that a man's or woman's spectral form could be seen inflicting pain testified to guilt. To the accused, it was an invisible accusation, impossible to refute. The Court of Oyer and Terminer, convened by Governor William Phips in the spring of 1692, quickly amassed a docket of imprisonments and indictments built in part on this spectral logic. Trial transcripts show the cadence of the courtroom, the clamor of onlookers, the formal questions posed by magistrates, the sudden outbursts of the afflicted, and the careful attempt to put the supernatural into human shape. An accused woman might be led before the bench and asked whether she had attended witches' meetings, whether she had entered into pacts with Satan, or whether she had sent her specter to torment the girls. Some confessed under pressure, others denied with vehemence. Names were called and cross-examined. Neighbors testified about grudges, debts, and old quarrels. The trials were not only about alleged pacts with the devil, but about the social texture of a village, property disputes, family feuds, and the precarious status of widows and servants. One scene returns again and again in the pages of the transcripts. A woman is accused, and at a signal, the afflicted convulse, shriek, and claim to see the accused specter. The court records are full of such synchronous theatrics. Clergymen like Cotton Mather and, to to a different extent, his father, Increase Mather, wrote and debated publicly about the propriety of using spectral evidence. Cotton Mather, in his 1693 pamphlet, Wonders of the Invisible World, defended the involvement of ministers and sought to prove that demonic activity was real and dangerous. Increase Mather, more cautious, would later write that it was better that 10 suspected witches should escape than one innocent person be condemned. A line that captured the tension between religious zeal and judicial restraint. As the season of accusation gathered force, the machinery of the law became grimly efficient. Those who were accused were imprisoned in cramped, disease-prone jails in Salem and Boston. Men and women were brought before the special court, and testimony piled against them. Neighbors recalled quarrels, servants testified to odd behavior, and the afflicted identified familiar faces in the theater of their visions. In June and July of 1692, the first executions began. Bridget Bishop was the first to be hanged on June 10, 1692. Over the following months, the gallows at Gallows Hill would claim others whose names have come down through history. Rebecca Nurse, John Proctor, George Burroughs among them. Each execution was a public event, a moral spectacle that both satisfied and inflamed the village's dread. One of the most grotesque episodes in the legal record is the death of Giles Corey. When accused of witchcraft, Corey famously refused to enter a plea. In order to force his hand, court officers pressed heavy stones upon his chest in a procedure called peine forte et dure. The law permitted pressing to extract a plea. The man endured weight upon weight, and, when asked if he would plead, he is said to have replied succinctly with the words, "More weight," an answer repeated in folklore and legal memory. He died after days of pressure, refusing to admit guilt that would have forfeited his estate to the crown. Corey's death, slow and brutal, became a symbol of the cruelty baked into a system that confuses confession with truth. Yet the story of Salem did not end with the executions. As months passed, doubts crept into public discourse. Some ministers and magistrates began to balk at the constitutional and ethical basis of spectral evidence. As autumn turned the leaves, Governor Phipps and others responded to rising criticism. The Court of Oyer and Terminer was dissolved in October of 1692, and new courts were convened that rejected spectral testimony. Over the next decades, the colony's leaders would revisit what had been done. In 1697, some efforts were made to acknowledge error. In 1711, the General Court passed an act that provided financial restitution to some of the families of those convicted. The process of legal redress was fitful and incomplete, but it marked a public recognition that a judicial frenzy had gone too far. The human aftershocks of those years were raw and long. Survivors returned to lives strained by stigma and widowhood. Families were left to steward the reputations of their dead against the tide of public memory. Ann Putnam Jr., one of the most active accusers, published a public confession in 1706, apologizing for her role in the prosecutions and attributing her actions to a delusion and spiritual affliction. Her apology is one of the rare, candid documents in the archive, an attempt to name culpability and to find a way toward healing. Even as courts reopened and official historians debated, another layer of the Salem story took hold. The realm of hauntings and spectral sightings that blurred history into legend. Accounts circulated of ghostly presences in the old homesteads, of strange noises heard at night, of doors opening without hands. Sometimes these post-trial stories echoed the earlier accusations. Neighbors claimed to hear late-night shrieks along the roads where prisoners had been led. Others swore that an executed person's apparition returned to stand at a threshold or to peer through a parlor window. For example, the homestead, long associated with the Proctor family, became a focal point for both grief and rumor. John Proctor had been a prosperous farmer and a vocal critic of the trials, and his execution in August 1692 seemed to many a grievous misstep. Stories told of lights in the windows of his house after his death and of servants who would not sleep beneath its rafters. In other corners of Salem village, local lore claimed that on certain nights, one could hear the echo of a hangman's step or see a pale figure walking the road where prisoners were taken to Gallows Hill. These tales, often recorded decades later, mix memory with imagination. but they kept the story alive in a community that needed to reckon with its wound. The cultural afterlife of Salem extended far beyond New England. In the 19th and 20th centuries, writers and playwrights found in Salem a ready allegory for moral panic. Nathaniel Hawthorne, whose ancestors lived through the era, wrote stories steeped in the shadow of 1692, turning personal family shame into national literature. Arthur Miller, in his 1953 play The Crucible, recast the trials as an allegory for McCarthyism, using Salem to illuminate the danger of unfounded accusation in any era. Miller's play transformed the historical event into a modern parable, and since then, Salem's history has been taught not merely for the details of its tragedies, but for the ethical warning it embodies. Salem today is both a memorial and a marketplace. In 1992, on the 300th anniversary of the trials, the city of Salem opened the Witch Trials Memorial on a quiet, contemplative site near Proctor's Ledge, inscribed with names and dates so that the dead would not be swallowed by time. Nearby, the Salem Witch Museum offers a theatrical retelling. Ghost tours thread through the old streets. Plaques and historical markers seek to educate. The town has learned to hold both solemnity and commerce in tension, recognizing that the story's power draws visitors even as those visitors demand respectful interpretation. What finally does the record ask of a modern listener? The Salem transcripts and depositions are not theater fodder. They are documents produced in real time by frightened, sincere people who attempted to make sense of suffering in a world where the supernatural and the legal were braided. The haunting stories that followed, the whispers heard behind closed shutters, the shadows walking the roads at night, are evidence of a community trying to tell itself what had gone wrong and how to live after such an error. The most chilling lesson of Salem is structural rather than supernatural. When institutions are poorly designed to check panic, when fear is amplified by authority, and when vulnerable people, the poor, the infirm, servants and women, become the easiest targets for social anxiety, injustice becomes not just possible, but likely. Spectral evidence was not a silly mistake. It was a legal loophole that allowed imagination to be constitutionalized. Trials that might have required forensic proof were instead resolved by visions, by fits, by the force of a frightened town's consensus. Yet, the story also leaves room for human repair. Acts of apology and restitution, however belated, were attempted. Individuals like Ann Putnam Jr. voiced remorse. Scholars have spent centuries untangling motives, pressures, and social structures. Artists have used Salem as a mirror for other moral panics. Communities have built memorials so that those who perished are named and remembered rather than erased. On a late afternoon in modern Salem, one can still feel the old tension in the air. Tourists wander past restored Georgian houses where, 3 centuries ago, neighbors once whispered and accused. The wind that rises off the harbor feels like a reminder that the past is never dead. It shaped the laws and the stories that followed. To stand in that town and read the names on the memorial is to be pulled back into a moral question that is as urgent now as it was then. How will a society protect itself from fear, while still taking seriously the real suffering of its people? And so, the story holds as both history and warning. The voices recorded in 1692, the confessions wrung from the frightened and the guilty, the witness testimonies that named specters, these are not merely quaint colonial artifacts. They are evidence that ordinary people, pressed by uncertainty and belief, can turn on one another with tragic consequences. The alleged hauntings and ghost sightings that followed are the community's continuing effort to reckon. In the end, the Salem witch trials ask a question about human judgment that we cannot outsource to cable news, to algorithms, or to fear itself. They ask us to guard how we determine truth, to preserve the rights of the accused, and to be humble in the face of suffering we do not fully understand. Above all, they remind us that memory matters, to name the dead, to recall the wrongs, and to try, however imperfectly, to make amends. If the wind brings a faint whisper as night falls over Salem's old stones, listen carefully. It is the sound of a town still learning to live with what it once became, when the line between suspicion and proof blurred. Remember the names carved in the memorial. Remember the long, slow work of apology. And remember, too, that the most haunting voices may not belong to ghosts at all, but to the living who survived, who testified, and who later repented. Voices that still call us to do better.